Online fraud is a serious and growing problem that affects millions of people in the UK and around the world. Online fraud is when someone uses the internet to deceive, trick, or scam someone else out of money, personal information, or other valuable assets. Online fraud can take many forms, such as phishing, identity theft, investment scams, romance scams, fake goods, online shopping fraud, and more. According to the Office for National Statistics, ONS, there were 4.5 million fraud offences in England and Wales in the year ending March 2022, a 25% increase compared with the year ending March 2020. Of these offences, 61% were cyber-related, meaning they involved the use of the internet or any type of online activity. This suggests that much of the increase in fraud offenses was because of a rise in cyber-related fraud and may be related to behavioral changes during the coronavirus, COVID-19, pandemic, and increased online activity. Online fraud has a huge financial and emotional impact on victims. In 2020 alone, £376.5 million was lost to internet and e-commerce fraud in the UK, which was more heavily impacted by this type of crime than any other country in Europe. Across the previous decade, more than 1 in 9, 12%, of Brits have been affected by this kind of fraud, with a value of £8,908 loss per 1,000 inhabitants. Online fraud can also damage trust, confidence, and security in the digital economy and society. Online fraud is not only a challenge for individuals, but also for businesses, organizations, and governments. Online fraud can undermine the integrity of online services, transactions, and systems, as well as expose sensitive data and information to malicious actors. Online fraud can also increase costs, reduce revenues, and harm reputations for businesses and organizations that operate online or rely on online platforms. Online fraud can also pose a threat to national security and public safety, as some online fraudsters may be linked to organized crime groups or terrorist networks. Online fraud is a complex and evolving phenomenon that requires a coordinated and collaborative response from all stakeholders. This includes social media firms, which have a key role to play in protecting online fraud victims and preventing online fraud from happening in the first place. The UK banking industry has proposed a radical solution to tackle the growing problem of online fraud, making social media firms liable for the losses suffered by their users. According to UK Finance, the trade body that represents the banks, 78% of authorized push payment scams, where a victim is tricked into transferring money to a fraudster, started online in the second half of 2022, and most of them originated on social media platforms. The banks argue that these platforms are profiting from the scams by allowing them to advertise and operate on their sites, and should therefore share the responsibility and the cost of reimbursing the victims. The proposal would require social media firms to contribute to a fund that would be used to compensate customers who fall victim to online fraud, regardless of whether they bank with a member of the voluntary reimbursement scheme that currently exists. The banks also want the government to introduce legislation that would make social media firms legally accountable for removing scam adverts and content from their sites, as part of the online safety bill that is being debated in Parliament. The proposal has been backed by some consumer groups and MPs, who say that social media firms have not done enough to protect their users from fraud and misinformation. However, the proposal has also faced criticism from some quarters, who argue that it would shift the blame and the burden away from the banks, who should do more to prevent and detect fraud in the first place. Some also question whether social media firms have the ability or the authority to verify the legitimacy of every advert or post on their platforms, and whether such a measure would infringe on free speech and innovation. The proposal by UK bankers is an ambitious and controversial attempt to address a complex and evolving challenge that affects millions of people every year. It remains to be seen whether it will gain traction and support from the government and the regulators, and whether it will make a difference in reducing online fraud and improving consumer protection.